We are in trouble. Not only the United States, not only Iran, not only the Middle East, the world is in trouble. And I will explain to you a little bit about that. So, in order to understand the United States and what ticks in this big enterprise, you need to go back to the beginnings of the United States and the real story of what happened, not the Hollywood version, not um, the humble, peaceful, uh, humanity-loving Puritans who just came to the United States to observe their own form of religious faith. You need to go back and really understand who these people were, what happened at the very beginning, to understand what was unleashed on the North American continent and why that has anything to do with today. So, the first thing to say is that the colonizers of the Newfoundland um, were the Puritans. And how did the Puritans get chosen to go to the Newfoundland? Well, first, the Puritans were not very welcome in England. They were extreme religious fanatics, and so they were not going to be very useful in England. They would be constantly in religious wars. So anyway, um, the idea is that the bankers found the Puritans as a great asset to get them to the Newfoundland. And why would they have to get to the Newfoundland? Because they would be the wedge that would crack the nut of this Newfoundland. They would find the resources that would enrich England. It would repay the bankers who had put up the money to get the Puritans there in the first place, and the Puritans would therefore help to extend the economic power of England. England already knew of the economic power that Spain was getting from the Newfoundland, all the gold and silver that was coming back in the shipload back to Spain, and creating one of the richest empires in Europe. So England wanted to do the same thing, and didn't want to try to take over the empire of Spain. It figured it could carve out its own empire. So the Puritans were chosen for that task. And like I say, the Puritans were religious fanatics, very hardworking, and very determined to live out their own religious principles in their own way. But they weren't too inspired by the charity which you'll find preached in the Gospels. So, anyway, these were not overly charitable individuals. They were hardworking, they were enterprising, they were frugal. So, these are good people to have. An investment for them to go and do the hard work to create this empire and to bring about economic riches for England. So move ahead maybe 20 years or so from their arrival to the Newfoundland. The Puritans had almost starved to death. And if it wasn't for the indigenous tribes there nearby who showed them how to grow crops in sand and how to survive locally, they would have suffered the same fate as the settlers in Greenland. So anyway, of course, you may have heard that the settlers in Greenland eventually all died and their settlements were destroyed. So they weren't able to maintain themselves, they weren't able to survive the harsh environment, and so these settlers, these Puritans, came to the Newfoundland with the goal of A, practicing their extreme religious beliefs, and B, they were there to carve out an empire for England. So at the beginning, everything was working smoothly. They were trading with England, they were doing very well, but one thing stood in their way. It was called the Pequot tribe. And the Pequot tribe, they were quite business-like individuals, and they were controlling the trade. And the Puritans decided that they didn't want any more intermediaries between England and the settlers. So they wiped them out. In one evening, they came, burned down their village, and anyone who managed to escape was cut down with a sword. So that is the founders of this country, and that was the initial spirit from which this country built its mentality of frugality, enterprising, empire building, and then wrapping up all this in a faith narrative. So eventually this narrative began to be understood as manifest destiny, from which the settlers expanded westward towards the Pacific coast, and eventually the United States the 50 states was formed. And of course there was the revolution, to the American Revolution, to free itself, the colonies, from England. We were told that there was taxation without representation, that there was a series of abuses, but the real problem with the colonies was that the British Empire was impeding the westward expansion of the colonies. They wanted to keep peace between the indigenous tribes, peoples, and the colonies, and the colonists were having nothing to do with that. So by freeing themselves from these chains of the British Empire, which kept them at bay and kept them from going westward and carrying out the same actions on the indigenous peoples to the west that they carried out on the Pequot peoples, then they were not going to be constrained by the British Empire. They were not going to be slowed down, and so over time there was more narrative creation about the United States, about its history, about God blessing this enterprise. So over the period of since the early 1600s, when the Puritans arrived, until today, this whole idea of expansion, this manifest destiny, has not only ended at the Pacific Ocean, but continued towards the rest of the world in a hegemonic push in order to control the entire world without any rivals. So this is basically the goal of the United States, started in the early 1600s with the destruction of the Pequot tribe. So now that the United States um, moved into the Pacific Ocean, took Hawaii from the Hawaiians. Um, so it was a Kingdom of Hawaii, or don't remember the exact title, and that was became a state through a bunch of maneuvering. And so once we are in the Pacific Ocean, then we began to expand throughout all of the Pacific, and our obstacle was the Empire of Japan, and of course that resulted eventually in a military conflict, and that pulled the United States into World War II, from which we um, uh, created for a time a rules-based order, which was just basically the rules were set by a few countries for everyone else, and those other countries had to follow those rules. But the big countries didn't always have to follow that when it was convenient. And eventually, when the Soviet Empire collapsed, the United States was freed again um, from the constraints of the Soviet Union, and to begin to expand NATO eastwards towards Russia, and to expand in other parts of the world as well. And not only through military means, but also through various agencies like USAID, National Endowment for Democracy, all these different foundations, etc. All these CIA created groups that would help the United States continue to expand its hegemony until it had control of everything on the planet. And again, this was started from the beginning, back in the early 1600s with the destruction of the Pequot tribe. This isn't something that just came into existence a few years ago. This isn't even the creation of President Trump or President Bush or President Reagan, um, or any of the earlier presidents. So um, you say, well, why are we in trouble? If the United States has control over everything, then we will all be at peace. Well, things don't quite work out that way, because there are some nations that either refuse to fall under this hegemony because of their culture, their history, their economic power, their military power, or simply because they are unequal and they're not willing to bow down, a near equal with the United States, and they're not willing to bow down to the United States. So therein we will get conflict. So right now, and you say, well, what does that have to do with Iran? The Puritans wrapped everything up with a struggle between civilization and chaos, or savagery. And so the savages were the indigenous people. So the savages were the Iroquois and the Apache and the Chippewa and all these different tribes. They were the savages, and the United States needed to put order and to protect itself from all these savages. So, and of course, they did that with the blessing of God through something called manifest destiny. And now we are in a situation where Iran was painted as the savages. So they haven't quite used the term. Eventually, they probably will at some point. But they are the quote unquote savages. They are the people that need to be ordered, and they need to be freed from this, this savagery, the theocracy, the and they talked about the cold-blooded murder of peaceful demonstrators. They talked about a number of 17,000. Some even said 50,000. Of course, Iran talks about 3,117, and many of the dead were police officers who were killed by the demonstrators. They were first responders. They were hospital staff. They were innocent bystanders because these individuals who infiltrated a peaceful demonstration about the worsening economy had infiltrated these demonstrations and then began to create havoc, burning buildings, shooting random people to create body counts, and of course attacking the police force and first responders, nurses, whatever. So getting back to this whole point of this situation in Iran, so the Iranian government was painted as savages, and that they were an imminent threat to humanity. They were 1 or 2 weeks away from having a nuclear bomb, and of course they were savages. The only thing they know what to do is to kill and destroy. So we had to take preventative measures to make sure that we were safe and the world is safe. So, I mean, that was the narrative being put out, but it's very similar to the whole story of the creation of the United States. So you can see that when Marco Rubio was at the Munich Security Conference, he was talking about, the settlers moving westward in an empty, an empty countryside, and they created this wealth from basically raw, natural countrysides. Well, we all know that the country was not empty. It was emptied, but it was not empty. And they did create plenty of wealth. But the point is that, of course, what does Iran have? Iran has lots and lots of natural resources. And so they want to create this narrative of savages. And of course, we need to go in there and teach them a lesson. We need to take control, and we need to remove all the evil people. And of course, we will bring wealth from the raw countryside, from their resources. So basically, this is the story of this whole conflict, which was a regime change conflict, and the goal was not only to knock out the government, which would stop us from taking these natural resources, but also we would make an empty promise to enrich the Iranians, to leave them happier, healthier, wiser, and richer. Of course, the same promise they made to the Iraqis when they decided to invade and remove Saddam Hussein. So, anyway, and the reason why we're in trouble is that they are not going to be able to remove this government through airstrikes. They are going to need to put boots on the ground. So if they put boots on the ground, that means another invasion force, and we could be looking at 10 to 20 years conflict here for the United States to realize that they don't really want to be there anymore, and it's time to wrap it up and leave. So, of course, the United States left Vietnam with nothing, basically. They left Afghanistan with nothing. But President Trump is a little bit more extreme in his views. He feels that if he can't get what he wants, he may have to use nukes. So that is why we are in trouble, because if President Trump starts to use nukes, that will definitely bring in a bunch of countries. That could bring in Pakistan, that could bring in Russia, that could bring in China, although I'm not too sure about China. Um, anyway, this conflict um, only seems to have one end in mind, and that is that the United States is going to go and do what it takes to try to do a regime change, which means boots on the ground, and then they will try to take the assets of Iran. So, um, again, why are we in trouble? Because this will be a long conflict similar to Vietnam, and the result will be the same. But this time, instead of simply abandoning Vietnam and saying good luck and farewell, they may drop a nuke or two, and that will put us into very dangerous territory. So, um, anyway, that is my video about why we are in trouble and the history of that. So, if you want to leave any comments below, um, commenting about this conflict and why you think we are in trouble, please feel free to do so below in the comments. And I look forward to seeing you back for a future video here at the Rowell Report. Again, thanks for joining me, and I wish you very well. Take care. Bye-bye.